Hi, today we are going to talk about employment of Harpoon anti-ship missiles. Manual explains the settings and controls well, but there is more to it than what button does what. NATO launch brevity word is bruiser, and the maximum range you can launch from is 97 nautical miles. Take note that this doesn't take into account wind and target ship performing defensive maneuvering, so the actual recommended launch distances are smaller. Target acquisition is done with the ground radar in C mode. Normally, it maxes out at 80 nautical miles, but with interleaved option boxed, you can extend the display to 160 nautical miles. Even if the radar is too far to generate a brick over a ship, you can still spot primary echo on the scope and mark it passively with TDC down. While it can be used for RBL launches, it won't give you any information on the target's movement. Speaking of radar, when DCS finally simulates Earth curvature, you'll have to fly higher to allow the radar to look farther away. For the maximum range of 160 nautical miles, you have to climb to 17,000 feet. Bricks usually appear around 120 nautical miles, and that radar range would require 10,000 feet of altitude. Alternatively, if you want to be sneaky and approach at the lowest possible altitude, 3000 feet would give you only 67 nautical miles of radar search range. As a reminder, the minimum launch altitude is 2500 feet. Anything lower than that and the missile will hit the water. The manual states the altitudes for the three available cruising settings, but the speeds are important as well. They can be used for calculating time on target or how fast you should be flying to give the missile a boost on launch, but not to overtake it at the same time. 400 knots indicated seems to be a good general purpose value. Take note that the higher the missile flies, it covers the distance faster, which means shorter time on target. However, since all heights begin the descent at 20 nautical miles from the target, the higher the missile cruise altitude, the longer it will be penetrating through any air defenses. Because of that, use high profiles for fast but lightly armed targets, medium for terrain clearance, and low for the better armed but slower ships. As on the day of making of this tutorial, you can use any combination of cruise altitude and seeker range for BOL launches. During my tests, all of them were able to find the target and guide to it. One more observation, before we get to the most interesting part, is that it pays off to alternate between skim and pop terminal profiles, to create more problems for close-in defense systems, so that they can't destroy multiple missiles in one burst, for example. During my testing, I have arrived at 4 recommended launch profiles. In order from the most common to the most specialistic one, they are: Profile 1. RBL mode, see radar target lock, launch from 80 nautical miles to keep some margin for wind and target maneuvering. That is the standard general purpose profile, good for most missions. It's also the most convenient to use, as it's mostly automatic fire and forget. Profile 2. BOL mode, designate the target with radar softlock and again, launch from 80 nautical miles. Set seeker range to 55 nautical miles and missile self-destruct range to 95 nautical miles. You can shorten the self-destruct as required so that the missile won't hit anything behind the proper target. But on the other hand, sometimes missiles go past the target, perform 180 turn and hit it from the other side. Set missile launch heading by flying directly towards the target and reading it from the radar scope. This is the same as Profile 1, but this time in manual mode. It's more stealthy, since you won't be locking the target. You can even launch at steer point without turning the radar at all, but the missiles sometimes may fail to find the target. Profile 3. Same settings as for Profile 2, but this time set the seeker range to 55 nautical miles and use low cruise altitude. Launch from 70 nautical miles. This forces the missile to descend to just above the waves much earlier, which helps with penetrating of ships' air defenses, but shortens its range. Currently, it is pretty much required strategy when facing Red Force cruiser Moskva, cruiser Piotr Wielki, or destroyer type 052C because of their substantial anti-air missiles range. This setting completely bypasses Moskva's missiles and does the same for the first layer of defenses for the two remaining ships, which allows Harpoons to close in much more before being engaged, thus reducing the time during which the enemy can shoot them down. In other words, you have to launch a volley of missiles anyway, but more of them will get to the target. Profile 4. I found that missiles have a hard time hitting ships that sail on a perpendicular heading and are faster than 23 knots, because quite often when the missile arrives at the interception point, the target has already sailed out of missile's radar cone. We can mitigate that with Harpoon steering point to allow the missile to arrive at shallower angle. Since Harpoon steering point can be set with a mark point, we'll use that, as it's faster and more flexible than using steer point, be it pre-planned or created in flight. Lock the target to get info on its heading and speed. Unlock it and use the softlock method to designate a point in front of it. You can gauge the distance with the help of distance lines on the radar scope. Since the maximum range is 160 nautical miles, each pair of lines equals 40 nautical miles. Try not to force the missile to turn more than 70 to 80 degrees. 30 to 60 is enough. Once you have the mark point, set it as Harpoon turning point and designate the target again. Then look at the HSI, which also should be set to 160 nautical miles. Select seeker range from turn point and destruction range, so that the target sits somewhere between them. Set the missile's heading after the turn point by eyeballing it and correct the first one as required. Launch the missile so that the combined distance to the turn point and from the turn point to the target doesn't exceed 70 nautical miles. If you'd like to use the early low-level method with turn point, use the following settings: seeker range 35 nautical miles, destruction range 70 nautical miles, and aim for the target to be as close to the middle point between them as possible. Launch from 20 nautical miles before the turn point. Thanks for watching and see you next time.